Apple accidentally obliterated their own professional hardware market because their cheapest mobile silicon is just too damn good. I have a $4,000 Mac Studio gathering dust right now because a $500 clearance laptop handles my 4K workflow just fine. For decades, the notorious Apple tax forced creators to drop thousands of dollars just to survive basic workloads without their machines choking to death. Today, that financial paywall has completely collapsed. We've been tricked into buying wildly overpriced metal bricks that offer zero real-world advantage for the vast majority of users. This engineering irony is forcing the most aggressive corporate pivot in Apple history. They're abandoning the luxury fortress to become an inescapable global utility, and it all starts with the absolute death of the upsell. And I bought into it. I thought I needed it. I dropped the cash on this machine thinking it was the only way to chew through my workflows without breaking a single sweat. And yeah, it just seemed necessary for a professional, but it really isn't. It is just a trap for idiot tech enthusiasts like myself who can be upsold very easily. Because here is the fascinating, twisted reality of the consumer tech market today. When you take home that extreme $4,000+ high-end machine and put it against the absolute bottom of Apple's professional tier, the entire hierarchy completely collapses. I didn't need an independent case study to figure this out. I lived it, and it's hilarious. I went out and grabbed a base level M1 Pro MacBook Pro on clearance for roughly $500 and literally a fraction of the cost, and it completely undermined the giant metal brick sitting on my desk. Look at my desk setup right now. Before I had this heavy, expensive tethered Mac Studio, and now I have a lightweight battery-powered Micro Center clearance laptop with only 16 gigs of RAM. And guess what? I load up 4K ProRes footage, I do complex color grading, timeline scrubbing, and this $500 entry-level M1 Pro handles it just fine. Why is that exactly? Well, Apple built dedicated hardware acceleration for media encoding, right into the base M1 Pro's architecture. Brute force computer power is no longer the sole gatekeeper for high-end video production. For me and that average creative professional, that $4,000 desktop became an overpriced redundancy. It is a very expensive toy, not because it lacks power, but because the mobile chip in my budget laptop is just too fucking efficient. If you run the synthetic benchmarks, the M1 Max and the Ultra post phenomenal scores, but in the real world, when I export a 900GB 4K ProRes video, the time savings are there, but what do I need that for exactly? An export taking 2 hours to render versus 45 minutes is completely meaningless. Because I spend 30+ hours a week doing everything else, and at the end of the day, what's an extra hour and 15 of me just waiting and probably just playing video games and having fun? The performance gap just does not warrant the immense price delta for 99% of workflows. And this technological irony right here is the key to understanding Apple's modern market strategy. Apple didn't just design faster computers, they accidentally nuked their own high-end exclusivity. They built mobile silicon that's so incredibly good, they eliminated the necessity of the Apple tax for high-performance computing, and it forced them into a profound pivot. We're watching a brand transition from a luxury status symbol into a pervasive, highest-value utility. So to really grasp the magnitude of this shift, we need to look back. In the late 90s, after dodging bankruptcy, and straight through the 2010s, Steve Jobs positioned Apple squarely as a premium luxury brand. They were not playing the volume game. They were not trying to offer the cheapest entry price. Apple built what I call the luxury fortress. They relied on scarcity, Johnny Ive's unmatched industrial design, and this manufactured aura of cultural exclusivity to print money with record-breaking margins. It was a psychological trick. The hardware was beautiful, the walled garden software was locked down tight, and that justified the exorbitant cost. These were Veblen goods. The high price was the feature. You walk into a boardroom with that glowing Apple logo, and it instantly communicates wealth, education, and status. Now, you might be in the comments blathering on like crazy, talking about, oh, well, what about Samsung? Exactly. Well, let's talk about Samsung right now, I guess. When the smartphone wars kicked off, Samsung flooded the zone. They brought with them budget phones, experimental features, and heavy phablets with massive screens, styluses, custom operating systems. And when Samsung started catching up and even beating Apple in features and market share, what did Apple do? Did they drop the prices to compete? No, they doubled down. They became the flashy, expensive choice. The premium price was a filter. Samsung took global volume, but Apple vacuumed up the vast majority of the industry's profits. And this strategy bled into their computers as the notorious Apple tax. If you wanted a machine for heavy video rendering or 3D modeling, you hit a massive financial paywall. During the Intel era, this was enforced by the very real thermal limits of x86 chips. Budget Macs got very low wattage processors that choked under creative workloads like an asthmatic marathon runner. To get power, you had to buy the massive power-hungry Pro machines with giant cooling fans. There was no budget Pro Mac. You either dropped $3,000 to enter the club or you stayed in the kiddie pool. If we look at the eras, we see the pre-2020 Intel era, where it was just essentially a luxury fortress. Scarcity and design over specs. And of course, the Apple paywall. If we move forward a little bit to post-2020, the Apple Silicon era, which ushered in performance democratization. High base performance with diminishing returns. And now the 2026 utility era, it's all about value, saturation, the ecosystem lock-in, and aggressive base pricing. Apple's entire economic model relied on that upsell. They made base models just functional enough to tease you, forcing serious users up the ladder. And we all paid the Apple tax because inside the walled garden of macOS and Final Cut Pro, there was no alternatives. The fortress was secure, unless you wanted to build a Hackintosh. So with Apple Silicon, the math changed, and the fortress walls started crumbling. Not because of Microsoft, not because of Google, but because of an internal engineering triumph. In late 2020, we saw Apple's system-on-a-chip architecture change everything. They slapped the CPU and the GPU and the neural engine and the specialized media encoders onto a single piece of silicon. They bypassed motherboard bottlenecks, they introduced unified memory, meaning the CPU and the GPU shared the exact same memory pool, and the performance per watt was simply just off the charts. But this architectural brilliance created a massive, hilarious problem for their pricing strategy. The base level silicon was simply too fucking good. Because the M series chips are so efficient, the real world difference between a $600 machine and a $4,000 machine practically vanished for 90% of users. Just look at the M1 generation specs. The base M1 had 8 CPU cores and 68.25 gigabytes per second of memory bandwidth, with no ProRes engines. But the M1 Pro upped it to 10 cores, 16 GPU cores, and 200 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. And not to mention a dedicated ProRes encode/decode engine. The M1 Max doubled that memory bandwidth to 400 and gave you 2 media engines. And the M1 Ultra, well, yeah, it had 20 CPU cores, 64 GPU cores, and insane 800 gigabits per second of bandwidth, and 4 media engines. But here's the profound irony. Apple's engineering was too damn good. In the old days, a MacBook would literally freeze trying to play 4K timelines. With the M1 Pro, those dedicated ProRes accelerators slice through high bitrate footage like a hot knife through butter. Apple handed budget users the computational power of a Hollywood studio. And in the real world, a M1 Max finishes a heavy 4K export in 51 seconds, while the M1 Pro does the exact same in 1 minute and 30. The Max is technically twice as fast, sure, but the absolute difference is 39 seconds. If you're a solo creator and you are paying thousands of dollars to save 39 seconds, what the fuck are you doing? When my $500 clearance M1 Pro runs as silently and as reliable as a machine costing 8 times as much, high-end hardware becomes a niche. That Ultra tier with its 150 billion transistors is utterly unjustifiable unless you're in the absolute top 1% of users rendering 3D environments or compiling massive amounts of code. The math irrevocably changed. The Apple tax is dead because baseline performance is now baked into the cheapest silicon they make. Apple literally Osborned their own high-end market. They satisfied the masses so thoroughly that nobody needs to upgrade anymore. So what happens when your cheapest device satisfies almost everyone? Well, you pivot. You pivot hard. If Apple can't squeeze affluent adopters for massive upgrade margins, they have to win by offering undeniable value at scale. And what we're seeing right now in 2026 is the total execution of this philosophy. They're transforming from an exclusive luxury brand into an inescapable utility. And we saw the ultimate proof of this on April 20th. Tim Cook, the guy who steered Apple to a $4 trillion market cap, announced he is stepping down on September 1st to become executive chairman. And who's taking the throne? John Ternus, the 50-year-old senior VP of hardware engineering. This isn't just a desk swap, this is a massive corporate ideology shift. Tim Cook was the supply chain god. He optimized margins and exploded the services sector, like iCloud and Apple Music. He was an operations architect. On the other hand, John Ternus is a mechanical engineer, a product-first guy. He spent 25 years building physical hardware. The Apple Silicon transition from iPads, AirPods, Macs, and putting them into every single thing that Apple makes was all him. Putting him in charge signals one thing. Apple's future relies on aggressive hardware expansion and the ecosystem capture at every single price point. They're done resting on luxury branding. They are developing advanced hardware built for ambient artificial intelligence to be put into the hands of literally everyone. And the clearest proof of this, the MacBook Neo. Released last month, March 2026, priced at an absolute floor-scraping $599, and if you can manage to get the education deal, that is only $499. Steve Jobs would have rather burnt down the whole campus than sell a sub-$700 laptop. For years, Apple let Dell, HP, and Google Chromebooks fight over the cheap, low-margin scraps. Now, not anymore. Apple just dropped a tactical nuke on the budget PC market. And they didn't do it with garbage components, they did it with a spec sheet that is going to create a bloodbath with the MacBook Neo. For $599, you get the A18 Pro chip, the exact same silicon from the iPhone 16 Pro. You get 8 gigs of unified memory, a 256GB SSD, and a 13-inch Liquid Retina display, which is plus 2K in resolution. Not to mention, you get 16 hours of battery life and an all-aluminum chassis, which comes in silver, blush, indigo, and citrus. Now compare that to the $1,099 MacBook Air with the M5 chip. You get an extra 8 gigs of memory, but is there really any competition here? Because the MacBook Neo seems to be such a deal compared to the MacBook Air. And their target, the Glassroom. Apple got sick of losing K-12 to cheap Chromebooks. At $499, they're hooking students into the macOS, iMessage, and iCloud ecosystems early. This is the utility strategy. Lock them in for life, and they'll buy the expensive stuff later. But they didn't stop there. At the same time, they announced the iPhone 17e, which they priced identically to the MacBook Neo at $599. This was another one of their global volume weapons. Historically, budget iPhones were crippled with terrible storage or ancient designs. The 17e completely shatters that. For $599, you get the 256GB of base storage, that is double the iPhone 16e. You get the advanced A19 processor, the same one in the mainline iPhone 17. You get the 8 gigs of RAM, which is required for local Apple Intelligence, a 48 megapixel Fusion camera, and for the first time on budget tier, MagSafe and QI2 wireless charging. Keeping it at $599 while doubling storage and economy with rising memory costs is vicious. It neutralizes buyer hesitation entirely. Apple is literally cornering every segment. You got the low tier with the MacBook Neo and the 17e, you got the mid-market with the standard Air and the iPhone 17, the high-end market with the Pro and Studio lines, which is useful if you're doing 8K rendering or 3D work or compiling massive software. And by raising the floor of the baseline, they've managed to create a best of all worlds. They're targeting everyone. They're getting everyone involved. In the reality, this is the best thing Tim Cook did in his entire tenure. And that brings us where we are. The Apple of 2026 is an entirely different beast than the Apple of 2011. Tim's passing the torch to John Ternus, but Ternus is inheriting the company while the world is in AI uproar. And Apple has to execute flawlessly to integrate AI without killing the battery or dealing with privacy issues. The walled garden isn't a luxury resort anymore. It's basic infrastructure for over 2 billion human beings. It works for me, and I absolutely love my $500 Micro Center clearance laptop, which deals with my 4K workloads flawlessly, just as well as my monolithic desktop that cost 8 times as much at the time. John Ternus, like Tim Cook, has some serious shoes to fill, and I'm sure he will mess up in his first few months, and I'm sure he'll mess up in his first few years. But that's what Tim Cook did. But I'm sure since they're putting a hardware guy in charge of the company, it'll be the standard to think of Apple as the undisputed champion of all realms of personal computing, mobile computing, and whatever else they develop in the future.